Nick, it's still not working. I don't know. Can you hear us? Maybe we should write him in the chat. Just checking, everybody from DOT and DCP are good to go. You know, you have all of your staff as panelists, right? You'll be able to share your screen. Awesome.
I believe so. Thanks, Luke.
Nick will be joining in a moment. We apologize for the technical issues.
Recording in progress.
Just a general note that if you're joining us from a phone today, you can press *9 to indicate you'd like to speak when we get to the public session, and we will unmute you.
Again, we'll be starting in a few moments. We're just having a little bit of a technical issue. We apologize to both the community board members and the public who is attending tonight. We apologize for this delay, but we'll be starting shortly.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Okay, this isn't fun anymore. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
But it looks like he just disappeared.
All right, last time that's going to happen. Good evening, everyone. This is Manhattan Community Board 5 committee meeting. My name is Nick Athanil. I'll be your chair tonight. We've got 2 items on the agenda. The first is a joint meeting of 4 committees: Public Safety, Quality of Life, Land Use, Housing and Zoning, Parks and Public Spaces, and Transportation and Environment. You may be wondering why we need a meeting of 4 committees at once. And that is because the matter at hand, which is the open restaurants zoning text amendment, requires the jurisdiction and expertise of all 4 of those committees. The second item on the agenda is a joint meeting of Public Safety, Quality of Life, Land Use, Housing and Zoning, and that will be a review of the Health and Fitness zoning text amendment. If you're here for any other matter, we'll reserve some time at the end of the meeting to open up the floor. I'll go through how we're going to operate the meeting. We've got a presentation tonight. The first item will be a presentation by Colleen from the Department of Transportation and Allison of the Department of City Planning, who will walk us through the open restaurants zoning text amendment. A few notes about procedure. All committee members must have their cameras on. It's a requirement of CB5. Please no questions or discussion in the chat. All communication must be on the record and in public. Without further ado, let's begin. Colleen, thank you for joining us.
Sure. Thank you for having us at the community board meeting. I'm going to have my deputy borough commissioners say the opening remarks, and then I will give a presentation.
Okay, Colleen, while you're doing
Colleen.
that, I'll ask Luke to pop into the chat the presentation, the PDF of the presentation, so that the community can follow along.
Sure.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you, Nick. Good evening, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Jennifer Santinez. I'm the Manhattan Deputy Borough Commissioner at the New York City Department of Transportation. First of all, thank you to Community Board 5 for convening this joint committee meeting and allowing DOT and our colleagues at DCP City Planning to present to the board tonight. With me this evening are my DOT colleagues, Colleen Chattergoon, who will be running through our slides tonight. We have Jackie Lazaro, Julie Shipper, and Karin Summer. We're here to present alongside DCP an update on the future open restaurants program and how the city is looking to turn this popular emergency program into a permanent one. As always, city agencies will be here to answer any questions, take down your feedback. DOT will present first, as Nick mentioned, then we'll hand it off to DCP and then wrap up with our Q&A. And so at this point, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and then hand it off to Colleen to present.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that lovely introduction. Next slide, Jennifer. At a high level, the permanent open restaurants program will be run by DOT to make available to restaurants the option of sidewalk and roadway seating for outdoor dining. This program will look to balance the many needs of the street and sidewalk, keeping restaurants and other users in mind. Finally, this program will take what has worked and what has not worked in the past, both pre-COVID and emergency, when developing the permanent future guidelines. Next slide. As you may know, the city had cafes before COVID, but far fewer of them. The majority of the programs were administered by the Department of Consumer and Workforce Protection. DOT ran one small pilot of the public roadway seating, which had a total of 25 setups citywide, most of which were in Manhattan. Our understanding is that the relatively low participation was in large part shaped by the cost and process associated with it. Next. As a result of COVID-19, New York City suspended existing rules through an emergency executive order to allow DOT to create a fast and simple way for restaurants to conduct their businesses in the public right-of-way, known as open restaurants. Since the launch about 1 year ago, over 11,000 restaurants have participated, which helped save 100,000 jobs that could have been lost. By many accounts, this program has been a lifesaver not just to restaurant industry, but also to the city that has seen outdoor dining and an incredible vitality it can bring to our sidewalks and streets as a beacon of hope and innovation in a dark time, a sign that our city can imagine a better future. Next slide. This year has taught us many lessons, both positive and negative. Those lessons are critical to how we proceed with a permanent program. On the positive side, we think the robust use of the emergency program was helped by three things. First, no geographies were off limits, unlike the pre-emergency sidewalk cafe program. Any restaurant with ground floor frontage and sidewalk or roadway space met the criteria could participate. Second, the program was free and easy to access. The pre-COVID sidewalk cafe program required months of multiple reviews. This program eliminated months of review and multiple agencies. And third, the element of roadway dining is completely new, giving more real estate to restaurants, particularly those who might not have enough room on the sidewalk to accommodate a cafe. It is also worth noting a few lessons learned from the emergency program. First, the speed of the rollout under emergency circumstances created some confusion. As DOT learned more about operating a program like this, some of the guidance changed. Second, throughout the program, DOT learned more about the challenges specific to the roadway seating and its interaction with the roadway. For instance, we heard from other agencies such as FDNY that there were issues with turning radiuses and safety signs being blocked. Safety is of utmost importance here and will remain so. Third, enforcement has been complicated on both sides. Restaurants feeling squeezed and over-inspected, and some communities, and particularly the mobility impaired, being concerned about under-enforcement. Going forward, this is something that will be addressed. Next slide. Given the widespread success of this program, the mayor charged us with developing a permanent successor to the emergency program, which requires changing a number of different laws that control outdoor dining in non-emergency situations. I'm going to talk a bit about what we are proposing for the permanent program, and then return to the topic of legal changes needed to effectuate it. Next slide. We anticipate that, like in the emergency, DOT would administer a permanent option for both sidewalk seating and roadway seating, and that eligible restaurants will be able to apply to use either both or within the frontage of their restaurant. The future program will still be available citywide to any restaurants with ground floor frontage and active DOH/MH license. Both sidewalk and roadway cafes will be required to be removable and will be subject to clear path and other siting criteria. Exact design requirements will be figured out in design guidelines process and rulemaking. We welcome public input, the design guidelines program. We think the most successful version of cafes are those that activate but don't privatize the street environment and that allow for street access for other users like street work when needed. Next slide. When final specific design guidelines will be very clear and will revolve around these principles, that balance of use of sidewalk space by a restaurant, but maximize the experience of openness and activation to the general public. Notably, the size and scale of cafes will be defined by the size and the street furniture on the sidewalk, which I'll talk about next. For most of the city, the old rule will hold 8 feet or half the sidewalk width, whichever is greater, which will be the standard clear path. That means if you have 11 feet sidewalk with no obstruction, like street furniture or hydrants, you could have 3 feet wide cafe. If you have 15 feet wide sidewalk, you can have a 7 feet wide cafe. In some areas with higher foot traffic, the city is proposing 12 feet or 50% overlay to ensure a little more walking room. There's 15 feet sidewalks, you would get a 3 feet sidewalk cafe. For restaurants that don't meet these requirements, we will have a waiver to go down to 6 feet. Waivers will be reviewed by DOT and the Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities. These requirements will be adopted into the rules, and restaurants will be required to provide proof that they can meet the clear path when designing their sidewalk cafe. Next slide. Switching to gears, we think the introduction of the roadway option is a tremendous new opportunity for restaurants, especially those who may have narrow sidewalks. For roadways, the new program proposes that they will generally be allowed as they are now in all areas of the city except where loading, bus lanes, or other street rules preclude. As with the sidewalk cafes, it's important that they be removable to allow for street work, and it's important that they remain unenclosed to allow for lines of sight between all street users to pedestrians, between cars and pedestrians, so that cars can see signs and so on. We are continuing to work with city planning, another agency, to define what kinds of shading and screening can still be allowed and meet that goal of removability. And when all input is in, when we plan to release a visual guidebook that provides specific reference for restaurants and the general public. We want to support flexibility and creativity while ensuring safety first. Both programs will be, as the sidewalk program already is, subject to sound rules, included prohibitions on amplified sound and hours of operation. DOT has to balance the use of the street with street improvements, not to mention weather events. For this reason, we are proposing the permanent program would be seasonal, with setups stored off-site during the winter. We are exploring the opportunity for a hardship waiver that would allow restaurants to keep their setups in place where storage is prohibitive. All restaurants will be able to keeping operating uninterrupted throughout 2022 winter season. Pre-COVID, restaurants applied to DCWP for cafes and had to complete an extensive application that required engineering drawings, insurance, and license fees that are sent to Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, formerly DCEA. DCWP had to review every cafe to ensure compliance. From there, the applications were forwarded to community boards and the City Council for public hearings, and then sent to the controller for registration. DCWP could also hold public hearing. This entire process could take 6 months or more. In looking at both moving the legal authority to run a sidewalk program over to DOT, and in creating new processes for the roadway setup, we are looking to streamline the review process as much as possible while leaving in place the essential roles of agency and public review. Restaurants will come to one agency. Restaurants will not have to file engineering drawings and can file online. Restaurants will have to pay a fee, but restaurants will have 4-year licenses, but still be subject to periodic checks. DOT will create detailed and visual instructions to ensure restaurants have clear guidance. The city will fund a robust enforcement unit with DOT to ensure both that restaurants and the general public can interact and act to ensure compliance. To make this permanent program a reality, 3 steps are needed to advance. First, which is the focus of today, is the removal of locational prohibitions through zoning. It's key to unlocking the full citywide universe of applicability and consolidating control and accountability for the program under a single agency. We are also working with the City Council to enact appropriate legislation, which will update the laws governing sidewalk cafes and then create a new set of laws and rules governing roadway cafes. Following zoning and legal changes, we anticipate rulemaking that formalizes many of the program design and application details, and then a formal opening up of application window for a new program, which will not have gone into effect. Restaurants and communities should feel some certainty that through that though we are beginning a process of developing the future program, the current emergency program is expected to be in effect as is for next year and a half, at least, with all expectation is that restaurants will have ample time to transition into a new process if they choose without disruption. Changing zoning is the first critical step to making this program permanent. But as you saw, there are multiple steps to developing the full program. Each step welcomes input, public input, and review involved. We're excited to be able to make this program permanent. COVID-19 has really shaped the way New Yorkers think about how our streets can be used, which has been a silver lining to the pandemic. Again, we welcome feedback and encourage all to visit our website to submit that how to us we do develop all the elements. I will now turn it over to DCP to talk about the text amendment changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. Hello, Community Board 5. My name is Allison Brown. I'm a senior planner with the Department of City Planning. I'm joined today with my DCP colleagues, Carolyn Grossman-Marr, Ben Huff, and Jose Thrucios. And I'm pleased to present today on the zoning text amendment, which, as our DOT colleagues discussed, is one element facilitating a permanent open restaurant program. Let's advance to the next slide, please. So as previously discussed, there are three main legal processes to create a permanent open restaurant program. The first, which is the focus of the rest of the presentation, is the removal of locational prohibitions by a text amendment. Unnecessary zoning restrictions stand in the way of thousands of restaurants from participating in outdoor dining past the emergency. The zoning proposal is key to unlocking the full citywide universe of applicability and consolidating control and accountability for the program under a single agency, the Department of Transportation. Next slide. So the proposed text amendment would remove the entirety of Chapter 1, Article 4 of the zoning resolution and related text in special districts and other areas that relate to sidewalk cafes in order to fully remove zoning from dictating locations of cafes. This will allow any restaurant to apply to the DOT for a sidewalk cafe if they can meet the required clear path and siting criteria. In the next slide, we'll go over a bit of context. So in March of 2020, there were roughly 27,000 restaurants in the 5 boroughs. 42% of these restaurants were in Manhattan. These restaurants range from small neighborhood cafes to more mid-sized high-end dining establishments to multi-level catering halls for large events. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll be focusing on the ground floor restaurants with access to the street, as it is these restaurants that have the ability to apply for a sidewalk cafe. Next slide. Sidewalk cafes have long been a part of the New York City streetscape, and with them, the laws governing cafes have evolved over the years. When ULURP came into existence in the 1970s, cafe approvals were subject to a full ULURP review as part of its revocable consent to use the street space. Almost immediately, it was recognized that this level of review was onerous and time-consuming and difficult to manage for each individual restaurant. So in 1980, the commission put into place a framework attempting to streamline the process by naming areas of the city where sidewalk cafes were allowed. Since then, the program has been amended dozens of times to make more and more fine-grained distinctions on where and what kind of cafes are allowed in the different areas. Up until COVID-19, zoning worked as the gatekeeper of where sidewalk cafes could exist. Next slide, please. So under the zoning rules, which are currently suspended, zoning dictates 3 different kinds of cafes and where in the city they can be located. So most common are unenclosed cafes, which allow for readily removable tables and chairs and fencing with no allowable overhead coverage other than umbrellas or retractable roofs. A small sidewalk cafe is simply an unenclosed cafe containing no more than a single row of tables and chairs adjacent to the street line, and it can extend no farther than 4.5 feet from the building frontage. And then finally, an enclosed cafe, which is defined as extensions of the building into the sidewalk using light building materials. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, zoning held the geographic restrictions of where these cafe types were allowed. Areas in yellow indicate where only small cafe types are allowed. Purple are areas where only unenclosed and small cafes are allowed. And green is where all cafe types are allowed.
Can I ask you to zoom in a little bit on CB5?
We'll also be going to some CB5 specific maps later in the presentation.
Okay, great.
And we can share this deck with you at the end. So the important thing to call out in this map is you can see a lot of areas where cafes were not allowed at all. This is the red and blue areas. So even if the sidewalks were wide and conditions otherwise would have allowed it, red signifies the areas specifically prohibited from having cafes, and blue is all the residential areas in the city where cafes are also not permitted. Next slide, please. So in March of 2020, the existing DCWP program had 1,224 cafes actively licensed citywide, mostly unenclosed, and the vast majority located in Manhattan. Next slide. As a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, New York State economy went on pause in March of 2020. This action resulted in a ban on indoor dining that impacted the industry harshly. We saw employment in the restaurant industry drop 64% from Q1 to Q2 in 2020, with the majority of these losses in Manhattan. Sadly, the city also lost some longtime institutions in the past year, as continued restrictions on indoor dining made it very difficult for dining establishments to operate. Next slide, please. So in order to provide support for the restaurant industry and the need to move dining outdoor, New York City began an open restaurant program that allowed for the emergency use of sidewalks and roadways by restaurants. This was achieved by suspending zoning and rules through an executive order that allowed restaurants to conduct outdoor dining in the public right-of-way. All zoning regulations and administrative code rules related to sidewalk cafe program were suspended, and an emergency self-certified program was set up by DOT. Street sweeping was scaled back, and restaurants were allowed to set up in the curb lane to provide additional seating. Restaurants can simply go to a website DOT created to apply for sidewalk cafe, roadway cafe, or both. Next slide, please. So to date, over 11,500 restaurants are participating in the open restaurant program. In particular, the city saw a huge surge of outdoor dining occur in the outer boroughs. 10,000 of the restaurants used the sidewalk in their outdoor dining setup. Next slide, please. So we've seen the challenges that the New York City restaurant industry has faced from COVID-19, and the open restaurants has clearly been essential to them surviving in the past year. An estimated 100,000 jobs has been saved by this program. The industry still has challenges ahead, but the open restaurants program has been able to provide the twin benefit of both helping small businesses flourish while also making New York City streets and sidewalks some of the best dining options in the world. Next slide, please. So during the program, there were 2,500 restaurants that were permitted in areas that would have been prohibited or limited under the existing zoning, but the proposed text amendment will allow them in the future. So looking at the map on the right, in red are restaurants in specific areas that were previously prohibited by zoning. These include commercial mid-blocks, certain special districts, under elevated rail lines, and other congested areas. In blue are all the restaurants in residential areas. As mentioned before, zoning doesn't allow restaurants in residential areas, but many of these uses predate zoning, and so they have remained. And so we estimate there are 2,900 citywide and 1,000 participating as part of the open restaurant program. And then finally, those dots in yellow are cafes and zones that would have been limited to the small typology only. So now we'll zoom into Community Board 5 specifically. In the next slide. So pre-COVID, Community Board 5 had zoning rules that allowed all cafes in some areas shown in green, yellow, and purple, which is generally along the wider avenues and more commercial areas. Cafes are not allowed in the areas shown in red. So this is the Theater District, the Garment District, Herald Square, around Grand Central Station, and then along Fifth Avenue, Madison Avenue, Lexington Avenue. Next slide, please. So under the pre-COVID sidewalk cafe process, the district had 62 cafes. One example is Sarah Beth's, shown in the image here on the corner of Park Ave and East 27th Street. As you can see, many of these are the small unenclosed cafes shown in the yellow dots in Midtown. And then just regular unenclosed cafes closer to Union Square. Next slide, please. So under the emergency open restaurant program, there were 702 cafes operating in Community Board 5. 204 of these would have been prohibited under current zoning. And you can see those again in the red and blue dots. The text amendment would allow these cafes the opportunity to apply in a non-emergency setting, but only if they meet the citing rules that DOT lays out, such as sidewalk widths. So for example, the image on the left is a restaurant located on Vanderbilt Avenue at the corner of East 44th Street. It is located in a specifically prohibited area under the previous regulations. The blocks around Grand Central were barred from having sidewalk cafes by zoning, and this restaurant would not have been allowed to have a sidewalk cafe. But under the proposal, restaurants in central business districts and those restaurants around Grand Central will be able to participate as long as they can meet those additional citing requirements. Next slide, please. So now just to go over a couple other cleanup actions in the text amendment. So the text will be removing definitions and cross-references to cafes, removing text that precludes operable windows that service outdoor restaurants, ensuring that no enclosure provisions require a restaurant to be fully indoors as a condition of its zoning district, and clarifying sidewalk widening text to ensure it does not conflict with the operation of the open restaurant program. The next slide, just also want to note that as a consequence of removing the zoning rules, we are also collapsing the different types of cafes. So the distinction of an only small cafe zone will be removed, and this will work in conjunction with supplemental clear path requirements that will address the need for wider pedestrian zones in some of the city's more trafficked locations, such as Midtown. And next slide. Finally, the text will be ending the zoning program effectively, ending the enclosed cafe program. So this program served a specific purpose pre-pandemic for a joint DCP-DCWP review of sidewalk cafes with particular conditions, which will no longer be necessary or applicable in the context of the future permanent program in development at DOT. So currently there are 102 pre-pandemic licensed enclosed cafes. Those would be allowed to continue to operate, but there will be no new licenses for enclosed cafes. So to summarize, we are at the start of a multi-pronged legislative process. Text amendment was certified by the City Planning Commission on Monday and is now referred to all 59 community boards and 5 borough presidents for 90 days. And we expect a return to the City Planning Commission this fall. We anticipate City Council actions to be underway during the same period, continuing the process of updating the sidewalk cafe and fully fleshing out the roadway cafe authority through a rulemaking process. Also underway during the summer and informed in part by community board consultations will be a design review process. We do not expect full program launch until late 2022 or early 2023 at the earliest, which gives a lot of time for restaurants to transition to the permanent program should they wish to do so. And now I'll welcome back my DCP and DOT colleagues for Q&A.
All right, thank you, Allison. What we'll do now is we'll open up the floor to the committee for questions and comments. I thought that because there's so many different components to the proposal that we'll organize the conversation sort of by topic. I think we'll first ask for discussion and questions about land use issues, then we'll move to transportation questions and comments, then matters affecting the sidewalk, and then finally we'll talk about quality of life issues. After we do that, I'll open up the floor to the public and ask for public comment. When that's complete, I'll put the committee into what's called a business session. During the business session, only the committee discusses the matter amongst itself. There could be questions, comments. At that point, no further input from the public or from DCP or DOT is appropriate unless requested by the chair. The committee will deliberate on the matter. There may be a motion. The motion of this committee will be our recommendation to the full board of CB5, which meets sometime in July. Please check the calendar for that. And then the vote of the full board at that meeting will be the position of CB5 on the matter. So why don't we hear from anyone who has any land use questions or comments about the presentation? Please press the raise hand button if you'd like to speak. Layla, why don't you start?
Thank you, Nick, and thank you to DOT and DCP for great presentations. I have a couple of questions more for clarification. You mentioned something about the fact that for cleanup of the definitions, that a indoor or interior space need to be a criteria. I'm not sure I totally understood. Does that mean that an outdoor restaurant could have some further outdoor cafe, or like any mobile restaurant could be eligible for a sidewalk presence?
Hi, I can jump in on that. And my name is Carolyn Grossman from City Planning. Thanks for having us again today. There are certain places in the zoning resolution. Well, actually, let me step back and say no to your question directly. What we're trying to do here is ensure that the cafes themselves under the open restaurants program are legal. There are places in the zoning resolution, like certain special districts and in certain contexts, where there's language that would require a restaurant to be fully within an enclosed space. So obviously you could not have an outdoor cafe and be in a fully enclosed space. So what we're doing is ensuring that that language is removed to clarify that restaurants that are properly authorized under DOT are not also precluded by this sort of anachronistic portion of zoning. But it's not intended to refer to mobile restaurants. It could, in certain circumstances, refer to a rear yard restaurant where that is otherwise legal. But its specific intent here is regarding the interface between an open restaurant, meaning a sidewalk cafe, and the interior restaurant.
I'm not sure I understand, but I'm gonna let my brain cells work, and hopefully it will make sense. My other sort of like question, comment in your presentation, you mentioned that the zoning restriction is unnecessary. I assume that there was a rationale for this language. I mean, it was a whole chapter of the zoning resolution. What was the rationale back then, and why is this rationale no longer applicable?
Sure, I'll jump back in, and thanks for the question, and apologies. I can come back on the closure issue. It's a little bit of an obscure thing, but I think I would say we can certainly point out the specific text to the board if that's helpful. I'm not sure if there are any implications for Community Board 5 in particular. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't recall any. But we can certainly follow up on that. I think going back to the sort of history of why the zoning resolution had sidewalk cafe rules and sort of geographies off limits in general, I think, we're very well-intentioned ideas for going back, long in time, that every restaurant would go through ULURP. I think the City Planning Commission was looking to create a regime that did not require every single cafe to go through ULURP, and instead name specific areas of the city where that would not be necessary, where there would be a process of review, but not as extensive as that full ULURP process, and that we could name those areas. But what's happened over time, I think, is those have become more granular, and some of the reasons why certain areas were considered off limits have been lost to time. And beyond that, I think the experiment with open restaurants has really led to a change in thinking that what's necessary is not neighborhood by neighborhood prohibitions, but strong citing criteria and enforcement that can really look at each individual condition and protect the pedestrian right of way and other things that make that cafe possible, but not have the city planning commission in the role of saying a neighborhood is completely off limits. So I think it's really a matter of what was good intention at a time, trying to respond to allowing for restaurants in a streamlined way, but seeing this experiment and really revisiting some of those issues, we feel that the citing criteria can be much more effective than that additional layer of zoning review.
Leila, did have
Thank you.
anything
And
else?
yeah, maybe on this obscure language, maybe we can check offline, and hopefully my brain juices will serve me better. But if I need further clarification, we can do it offline. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Leila. Renee Kinsella. You're muted. Try the space bar. There you go.
Wasn't working. There we go. Okay. My question involves the clear path guidelines. Given that there's a lot of foot traffic increase, I wonder if there's any anticipation of revisiting how often that criteria would be reviewed or just really looked at closely, given as the city comes back.
Carolyn, do you want me to take this one or?
I'll start in and you can jump in, Julie, just to say, I think it's a really good question about how often. We've been much more focused on what those initial rules are and really to confirm that obviously those additional 12 feet, many of the areas, if not most of the areas of Community Board 5 are where we're imagining those would be in place. So I think it is a good question when, once we adopt those new rules, how often they would be revisited. Julie, I'll let you, opine on this. I don't think we've given much thought to the specific schedule for that yet. It's a good question to make sure that they are revisited, but we have been really thinking about the assumption of some level of pre-COVID return and the need for that 12 feet, even in areas where today it may still be somewhat below what it had been, although coming back, I think, quite quickly.
Yeah, I think it's actually a really good point and something that DOT is really concerned with. We really want to make sure that pedestrian flow is something that is still kept in mind with this program. And that's kind of why we chose this or came up with the new clear path rules. But I think an excellent point to take a look at it, and put it in our rules that we will continue to look at it throughout the permanency of the program.
Renee, anything else?
No, thank you, Nick.
EJ?
Thanks. I think this counts as a land use issue because it refers to building materials, but it obviously affects a number of other things. So understanding that the emergency rules are destined to continue through winter 2021 and 2022 for virtually another year at this point. Beyond the emergency period, as we transition into a permanent program, is the intention of the rules to allow only like temporary or quickly you mentioned that it would have to be dismantleable. And I'm wondering what that metric is. How quickly does it need to be dismantled, and is the intention that it be kind of only done with more temporary materials? And I ask because a lot of the buildings that have been set up during the emergency period are what I would refer to basically as like a barn with 4 walls. They're solid structures. And I can't picture that being removed for street sweeping and then put back up the next day. Can you talk a little bit about what the intention here, and also if it's going to be seasonal, it doesn't need to be a heated barn, all throughout the winter. So can you talk about the intention of what types of materials are going to get used for this and how it might differ from the emergency period?
Yeah, so we're still going through a design process and still thinking about what the guidelines are going to be. This is, really an initial touch of us coming to you with where we're at right now. That will be a full public design process where people will have a chance to weigh in on what's to come. But we do see this. We agree with you that having the heated barns is not what we're envisioning, and has been really great for the temporary program, but not really what we see going forward, especially with the seasonality and other work and other balances of the streets that we need. So we don't have exact answers on what materials will be compliant, but it is still to come.
And do you have a sense of what the rule on how quickly it'll have to be able to dismantled might be?
It's not going to be like a take it off and put it back up in an hour type thing. But if there was emergency utility work that had to be done, it would have to have something that we want it to be sturdy, but also something that would be able to be taken up.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else for now, EJ?
That's it for now. I think my other questions are in other categories.
Cool. Janet Paulson.
Yes.
Did you have your hand up?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
Did I?
Todd,
I didn't intend to. Let me put it that way.
Okay. Todd Shapiro.
Hi there. This question or issue concerns only in part to the zoning applications. It may be related also to the quality of life in some of the other categories, but I'm going to mention it now because it's related to the spacing requirements that have been described in your presentation. So will the new regulations and will the review process take into account the actual head counts and activity and the volume of people going back and forth in the various locations? So I know, having been involved in review on a lot of these applications, that it's really the volume of people, which depends on where it is and the character of the neighborhood and the popularity of the establishments on the block. That's really the relevant issue. So, currently we have an equilibrium that's been built up over the years on account of our careful vetting of all of these places. I mean, I haven't heard anything, or I haven't seen anything in the regs or in your presentation about how that factor is going to be weighed or if it's going to be included in your changes. Can you comment on that?
Sure, I'll start. Julie, please jump in. Thanks for the really thoughtful questions. First, something that we should say, if we haven't said it clearly enough, is that the role of the community boards is not proposed to change here. So to the extent that you were looking at sidewalk cafes in the past, those will still continue to be referred out to the community board. So you will have that opportunity to take a look at them and continue to have that conversation. And also all of the roles of the state liquor authority and that particular function of the community board are not proposed to change here. So just to understand that process in that sense will look quite similar. You may see more cafes because some of the areas where an application was prohibited, now a restaurant may be coming to you for the first time. In terms of the particular pedestrian volumes, we did look at those, and that is what is informing in part that judgment to move to 12 foot in certain higher congested areas of the city where we weren't allowing cafes in the past. The challenge of this, as I'm sure you're alluding to, is getting that both, specific to an individual street. And I think, as one of the previous speakers alluded to, making sure that that's really current over time. That's a particularly hard thing without doing a lot more pedestrian counts. So we've done this in a fairly broad brush way that we think a conservative approach to making that higher pedestrian count in the areas where we do think it's going to be necessary. I think revisiting that over time makes sense. And there's some thought here that, you know, for that waiver category where we're looking at flexibility, that somebody might go out and do it, for instance, their own pedestrian count and say, hey, actually, you've got me in an area that's higher than you might otherwise need. So we think there's some ability to use additional pedestrian counts to try and, you know, adjust for that. But the overall pedestrian zones are being identified in part based on known information about pedestrian volumes.
So when I first saw this, my concern was just in one stroke making the availability and process for the restaurant program available everywhere. Was this didn't seem to have any concern about that issue. And in doing our review over the years, I've often said to myself, well, you know, where is the data on this? Having the community boards and the restaurants have to do this themselves. I mean, that's our job. But are you saying that you've actually, the DOT or the Department of City Planning actually has or has done a lot of detailed planning in terms of pedestrian volume? Could you make that available to us at the community board? So in assessing these changes, you know, we could look at it and make some judges ourselves.
The environmental review documents for this text amendment do have information about pedestrian volumes. It's not specific to every single intersection. So I think this is where, you know, what we're doing and what we have used is, you know, typological type, you know, certain types of streets and different kinds of pedestrian volume thresholds. So as I said, I think the challenge is making sure that the kinds of, you know, that the volumes that we're using to set standards end up being good matches for the streets on which they're being, you know, sort of facilitated. And that could work potentially in both directions. We think it's been a fairly conservative approach here. That information is available to the community board. And I think actually DOT may want to add more. There is some additional, you know, there is information somewhat about pedestrian volume citywide on an ongoing basis, but not, I think that the holy grail to which you're speaking, where we really have perfect information about, you know, the volumes on every given street, you know, over time, is something that we also do struggle with.
All right, so we'll try and get that information. Luke, if you could work on that, and then we'll take a look at it and see if there's anything missing. Anything else, Todd? Okay, Leila?
Oh, that's it for now.
Thank you. 3 additional technical questions. The first one is there going to be a difference between the roadway and sidewalk rules in the zoning resolution?
The zoning resolution does not cover the street, so roadway cafes are not affected by zoning currently and would not be affected by the text amendment.
Got it. Okay, so roadway is strictly DOT.
That's correct.
And any other agencies that have jurisdiction. Okay. The other question is there any rule about restaurants that have outdoor seating in pubs? Currently, my understanding is that if you have a pub, you can't have a sidewalk cafe. Is there any modification to this rule? Or maybe this rule doesn't even exist?
This text amendment is not seeking to change anything in a POPs. The question of whether you could have a sidewalk cafe and a POPs is an interesting one. I think you.
Sorry if I.
You go ahead, Allison. I'm just thinking. On one hand, you can't front on a POPs, but if you were like a restaurant that had some frontage that was not in the POPs, right, but you had some access to a sidewalk cafe, there might. Go ahead if you have more specific thoughts on this. It's not an interaction.
No, I just wanted to clarify that cafes are permitted in POPs, but it's a separate process entirely. They're called open air cafes, and restaurant owners who want to open their cafe in an adjacent POPs still have to come to city planning and go through the appropriate permitting process to do so. Currently, under emergency orders related to POPs, cafes have been able to open in POPs without going through this permitting process. But it's anticipated that that will eventually return once we're in a non-emergency state.
But my specific question is, if you have, because we have lots of those, especially in Midtown, towards the 6th Avenue corridor, we have buildings that have POPs, and there's restaurants there, and they are operating some, seating in these POPs, and these POPs basically abut the sidewalk. And currently, they're not permitted to put their chairs and tables on the sidewalk because, sidewalk cafes are not permitted, let's say on 52nd Street and 6, between 6th and 7th. Will this rule permit a restaurant to have a POPs and a sidewalk cafe, or do you have any provisions in the zoning resolution that would prohibit that or regulate that in any way, shape, or form?
So I think that if a restaurant wanted to operate both an open air cafe and a POPs and a sidewalk cafe, they would be going through two different processes to operate those two different portions of their restaurant in the two different areas, because the sidewalk
is, but one does not preclude the other.
I don't think so, but again, I think there's a lot of citing technicalities about like citing that they may be precluded because of the layout of the space, or where they are located on the sidewalk and other structures.
I would say I would suggest that this is one that would be helpful to follow up on a specific example, and we can get back to the board as well. In my mind, I think the real question is whether or not the restaurant has frontage that's applicable, and I think that may, in the emergency condition, may not be as clear. But if you have a restaurant that's in a POPs, I'm not sure if it actually has frontage on the street that would allow it to be qualifying for the open restaurants program. If it does,
I can give you two examples. Fogo de Chao, which I think is on 53rd. The POPs is abutting the street. The restaurant, the open air, POPs restaurant is abutting the sidewalk. Another one is Osteria del Circo. Same situation. Their POPs is actually alongside the sidewalk on whatever, 55th or so. But we can follow up offline on that. I don't want to take too much time. I have one more question, which is on the seasonality rule. Is this rule going to be included in the zoning resolution, or is it going to be a DOT rule?
The seasonality will be a DOT rule, and what we're looking at is the sidewalk would be full year round, and the roadway would have seasonal with the option of a waiver process.
Got it. Okay, thank you so much.
And just to say on the prior point as well, the goal of all of this is to take the rules for cafes out of the zoning resolution. So all of those future rules, including one that really, if there was a need to talk about how it interacted with POPs, the goal would be to put that into the DOT rules as well.
Okay, thank you.
David Killis.
Yes.
Did you have?
Unmute. And he froze.
Looks like we lost Dave. Let's get back to him. Renee Cofaro. Renee, unmute.
Yeah, I'm jumping in because Layla touched on one of the things I want to talk about, which is seasonality. Is that going to be, how is it going to be enforced? Or if, say a place invests in a lot of heat lamps and stuff, or would they be able to be all year round if they so choose? I mean, I know probably people wouldn't want to be there if it's not enclosed, but if someone wanted to operate all year round, would they be able to, or do you have specific end dates?
So the goal for the roadway would be to have it be seasonal, and there would be a waiver process that restaurants could apply if they really felt that they wanted to be year round, and DOT would review those specific sites and either grant the waiver to continue year round or deny it depending on what else is going on that specific block.
Will there be community board input on those waivers?
has not been, that part has not been completely decided on yet, but we can take it back and get back to you on the answer.
Yeah, and I noticed generally there are a lot of waivers for different things. And, you know, outside of this program, community board would be involved. So I don't want to see that change. David Keller, so you back? Okay. Anyone else have any more land use
You hear
related?
me now?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm having a lot of trouble with my computer.
I know the feeling.
Let's take a situation where we've had a very successful restaurant and they have perhaps been paying rent and they've got 15 tables in their restaurant. Now, after the COVID situation, they have an outdoor space with another 15 tables, thereby doubling their capacity and being perhaps twice as successful and making twice as much money. Here they are using city space and basically, would there be a rent on this city space or anything that the city would recuperate for its land use?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, one that we're grappling with as well. The city hall really wants, and as well as the agencies really want to make this a program that all restaurants can participate in, but the fee structure is still something that we are grappling with and still something that we're coming back to details on.
Okay, thank you. Renee Kinsella.
Thank you, Nick. Just really quickly, it's riffing off what Ted Shapiro was asking. Is there information about how this program overall impacts? There's a lot of competing interests. So bikes and cars and pedestrian just globally, you know, the impact does the environmental review speak to that?
The environmental review does not speak to it. What we're in this specific, in the roadway portion of the program, we are really looking to just have this in areas that, you know, where there was parking, and these would be in that parking lane. You know, that is something that DOT is also thinking about really heavily, is this, you know, competing space. Everyone is sort of fighting for the same space, and we have other mandates and putting in, you know, miles and miles of bike lanes and miles of bus lanes, and who gets this space. You know, that is not, we're trying to balance it all out and balance, you know, the use of this street for all competing uses. But that is something that, you know, I think as we go on and this program becomes permanent, will be something that will come up again and certainly come up a lot.
Okay.
And this is Ben from City Planning. Just to add to this, you know, one of the goals is to move this program to the Department of Transportation, who's managing a lot of those conflicting uses. So to have it all under the purview of one agency, we think will be a lot better operationally.
Okay. Renee Cafaro.
Yes, actually Dave's question kind of got me thinking. How would the certificate of occupancies work for these? So if you had a very small indoor, do you have a separate C of O for the outdoor, or do they combine? Like, for instance, would you then, if you had something like 15 tables inside or 15 people and you had a ton outside, you could make it into public assembly if you connected those two occupancies, or are they separate? Like there's outside occupancy and inside occupancy, two different C of Os. And is the roadway stuff a separate C of O? Or like when we look at an application, we want to look at capacity of what the operator is going to have. We just consider all of it together.
I don't have this specific answer, but I can get back to you on it.
Okay, thanks.
David Sigmund.
I had a quick question just about sort of the interagency aspects of this, that even though DOT is going to be the lead, that a number of these decisions have impacts on other city agencies. You know, sanitation, I assume the workload on sanitation goes up, the collection areas for garbage, just the generation of garbage, police department, you know, noise spilling out onto the street. You know, Department of Health, are these areas inspected by the Department of Health? I don't believe they have been during COVID, so I assume they will be afterwards. I know that you mentioned that there won't be a separate plan submission, but the combination of the outdoors, wood, and electricity tends not to be a great thing. Does DOB have some oversight, over review of this? Is 311 taking all of the complaints that come out of this, and then does it all get routed through DOT before it goes back to those other agencies? And a follow-up question on something else after we cover that.
Oh, sorry. Carolyn, were you going to speak? Or
go ahead, Julie. Go ahead.
I think the first thing is we've done a lot of interagency collaboration on even coming this far in the planning process here, and DCP and DOT have really been leading this effort, but through the environmental review have had to go to all the different agencies and really get their approval and sign off on what we're thinking. And as we continue with this planning process, and we obviously don't have all of the answers right now on what the program will look like, but as we continue coming up with what the program does look like, this is a very interagency program, as you had mentioned. There's so many different aspects of it that affect basically the entire city and every agency. So we plan to continue coordinating with all the different agencies as we do with most of our programs.
So there would be budget increases if necessary in other agencies' budgets in order to deal with all of this?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
If I just might add, I think it's important to remember, as the community board obviously does, because you were integral to this process, that the Sidewalk Cafe program has been in existence for some time. So that interagency nature of interactions is not new. Like, when it comes to outdoor dining, DOH was involved in inspecting outdoor cafes pre-COVID. Things have changed a lot in this emergency circumstance. I actually think, to Julie's credit, really has been a very strong interagency partnership, even in these sort of emergency and changing times. But I think that structure for interacting and making sure that each other's rules are being followed and adjusted for, that did exist on the sidewalk. Where we're dealing with it more, I think, is that the roadway is a new typology. And so there are these new issues that are raised to some extent by that, as well as just by the scale of the program incring.
Yeah, that's what I was going to focus on. Yeah. Just the scale growth, whatever issue existed under the old program, now it's 5x. And to the extent that something isn't resolved because the resources aren't there to resolve it in each budget, we're going to hear about it.
And it's an important question I think many of the agencies have for us as well, as what to expect of how large the future program is. And the truth is, we don't know, right? Because we're all still seeing what happens in the city. I think the goal of this text amendment and the whole program is obviously to create a more robust dining program than existed pre-COVID. But that doesn't mean that everyone who has had an emergency setup is likely to keep their emergency setup, especially if they don't need it and if there are fees and process that have returned to keeping it. So we know it's somewhere between those two poles. And I think, agencies are planning to make adjustments to their staffing needs based on that, but it's going to have to be a little bit of a work in progress as we actually see how many new cafes enter the future program.
Okay, let's move on and see if there are any specific transportation questions or comments. EJ.
So this is a little bit of an extension of that type of jurisdictional question, but I'm really wondering, and this might fall under the category of stuff to still be figured out, but with DOT taking ownership of the Sidewalk Cafe program, as well as the roadway cafes, I'm wondering how enforcement is going to work. So I could ask, and I might ask a number of questions about how enforcement is going to work over the remainder of the emergency period, because we know that there are, issues that have arisen, structures built in bus lanes and things like that. But I guess at this point, long term, I'm wondering exactly who's going to be enforcing violations, and most specifically, because things are being restructured to give DOT power over both of these programs at this point, is it DOT who's going to be empowered to write tickets, write violations on any of the violations of the program rules, whatever they end up being?
So I can speak a little bit to this. We are staffing up our enforcement unit. So right now, through the emergency program, we have had a number of staff that have gone out and are doing some enforcement. But of course, this program was stood up so quickly, and we really were very concerned with just enforcing the roadway pieces, as those we felt were, we needed to make those the safest and really make sure that those were in compliance. For the permanent program, we are staffing up our enforcement. We'll have a full team at DOT that is dedicated to this, and they will be the ones that are going out and making sure that everyone, their structures are in compliance. They're following all the different guidelines that we'll set out.
Anything else, CJ?
No, I think that's it. So they'll be enforced to ticket and write citations on those violations.
So they'll be enforced to give citations as well as any other violation structure that we come up with.
Okay,
Rachel.
Thank you.
Hi, so my question is specifically about bike lanes. So one, I'm wondering if there are any specific requirements that will be put in place about spacing. So obviously there are like spacing requirements with the sidewalks. So just wondering if there's anything similar with bike lanes. And then two, I've personally witnessed, I'm sure I'm not the only one, many very scary incidents where diners like step out into a bike lane without looking, or crazy bikers are going fast and almost hit people. So I'm wondering if there are any stats on any increases in accidents or things of that sort since this program was put in place. And also wondering if there are any proposed requirements for businesses in terms of, for example, I've seen some restaurants have kind of like stop signs to warn people to look both ways and things like that. So wondering if there's anything planned with regards to signage.
So I'll start with the bike questions first. We will have citing criteria for both roadway and sidewalk that really goes, looks at and citing criteria that, from obstructions, giving specific distance from things like a bike lane and other obstructions on the sidewalk and in the roadway. So that's first. On the stats, I don't have anything specific to give you right now, but we can look into it and come back to you.
Who would compile those stats?
Yeah.
Is that DOT?
Sorry, what the stats?
Who compiles those stats? Who maintains those?
I believe between us and PD, but Jennifer or Colleen, you may know better than I do.
Julie, I believe it's PD. I think you're right.
All right, we may have to track that down.
And then, sorry, what was your last question?
Business requirements for signage.
Oh, yes. We are coming up, as I mentioned, a full design guideline and having our engineers, a full engineering team, really look into this and then come up with these safety guidelines. So potentially there would be extra signage, but we don't know the answer to that right now.
Great. Simon?
This sort of concerns sanitation, so I'm not sure it's up your alley, but I'm curious, where you've got sheds that go into the street, and you mentioned earlier street sweepers not being, like, obviously can't get to the part of the roadway that's being covered. What's the overall impact to that street there? Is there any kind of detrimental refuse that's building up or vermin that are appearing because of them?
And I guess who has to clean that space?
Yeah,
that's inaccessible.
Yeah, I think, this is one of the things that we are definitely working, and that interagency collaboration is, so key here. So really working with DSNY on street sweeping on these specific neighborhoods. And, one of the things that DOT is putting forth in this program is having a team, as applications come in, really look at full blocks in this holistic way. And if there are a number of restaurants on that block, finding space for loading and sanitation and all of these different things, where if just not just restaurant after restaurant after restaurant, where then no one else could, do any of their business.
Okay. David Sigmund.
I had a quick question on parking, since that's, the bulk of where the space for this is coming from. Is there some sort of specified minimum amount of parking so that a restaurant might apply and find out that there's, you've hit your minimum parking, therefore no additional restaurants can be added on a block? Is that one of the binding constraints?
Julie, I can take this if you want. So this is something I think Julie just mentioned. One of the things we want to put in place for the permanent program is to kind of have a review that's triggered when there is like a block of restaurants along one corridor. So we're not saying like you're the 8th restaurant on this block, you're too late, you don't get it. That's not at all where we're coming from. But we just want to like know when that happens so that we can kind of take a look at that corridor comprehensively and make sure that parking and loading and accessibility and everything is still accommodated.
Thank you. Layla?
Thank you, Nick. You've been referring to the design guidelines a number of times. Can you actually talk about the timeline for these design guidelines? When are they going to be developed? And are you going to have hearings about them?
Yeah, sure. On our last slide, I think whoever's controlling the slides, if you can go to the timeline, that would be helpful. But basically, over the next many months, and basically throughout the end of this year, we'll be coming up with rules and going through the public design process, where there would be input from the public that we would be welcoming, and so you would have some time to give your feedback there. And it would be
would you come back to the community board for a presentation on the design guidelines?
We certainly could, as they're developed. Yeah.
Okay, and my other more specific question is, how do you intend to mitigate the conflict between pedestrians who are going to walk on those sidewalks and staff of restaurants serving patrons on the roadway? It's been a huge problem in our district.
One of the things that Carolyn talked a lot about and our team spoke about earlier were the clear path rules that we think really need to be put in place in order to make sure that there is still this like clear flow for pedestrians and other uses on the sidewalk. Over the temporary program, we did have this rule of 8 feet, but it really has not been enforced because, as I said, we had stood this program up so quickly. We were really concerned with the safety in the roadway and not as much focusing on the sidewalk, but that would not be the case in the permanent program. We would be very much enforcing that clear path rule.
Okay, I just want to point out to the fact that 20th Street between Broadway and Park Avenue South is a very, very problematic situation where you have a congregation of small restaurants. So basically you have a multiplication of, staff and, it's not like one big restaurant that has, a large frontage and then, one cohesive staff. It's a series of restaurants. They're very popular. They're very well patronized and we wish them well, of course, but as a result, using the sidewalk, it has become very problematic. And they use these like electrical cords, that are on the sidewalk that are a terrible tripping hazard. So I'm just, mentioning this particular block, but, I'm sure there are others in our district.
I appreciate it and wrote it down. We'll have our inspectors take a look.
And
Great.
if I may
Thank
just
you.
add one additional point, under the pre-sidewalk DCWP program, servicing from outboard of the cafe was precluded. So it's expected that that's got to come inboard. Again, like that's not necessarily what's happening in the emergency. We know that, but it is expected that that would be inboard. That's a little bit of a different problem that I think we were also noting, that if you're servicing the roadway, you do have to get to the roadway, right? So there's crossing issues. Additionally, I think someone also noted earlier and I just want to make sure that we clarify that though the goal is not to have an engineer drawing, there is an expectation that you will have to show DOT what you're doing, and show them the obstructions and the setup so that all of these design principles can be confirmed. The point is to do that through an online process that's much simpler, but not to do away with that review functionality, which is so important to seeing how all of these different pieces fit together.
Thanks, Carolyn. Joel?
My question was originally about part of the second presentation where you showed a sidewalk cafe in the road. You showed a cafe in the roadbed in the street near Grand Central and said this would have been prohibited under the previous regime per se, but now we're able to do it under, yeah, exactly. No, I'm sorry, it wasn't that one. It was one where there was nothing on the sidewalk itself, only in the street bed. So my question was, are you going to be treating sidewalk cafes on the sidewalk and cafes in the street bed the same? And I want to tie this in a little to what Layla and Rachel spoke about before, which is bike lanes and clear path issues. So, you know, previously when you had an 8-foot clear path on the sidewalk, pedestrians could and frequently did step into the street to get around when it was too crowded, when there was only 8 feet left, and that's really a lot in most of our district. But now you can't go into the street because there's a street bed cafe. If you're in the bike path or someone's in the bike path and there's another obstruction in the bike path or a waiter coming out of a restaurant, you were able to swerve out into the street on your bike. You can't do that anymore because there's a cafe there. Are the clear paths for pedestrians, for bikes, and also for car traffic all being taken into account together when you plan all of these, granting all these permits for street bed cafes and sidewalk cafes all on the same streets?
Yeah, and yes, and it's an excellent point. And I think, you know, what Cara and I were talking about, this team that's really looking holistically at the blocks, you know, will be able to look at where where restaurants are setting up on both the street and the sidewalk, and really make sure that there is space for everyone and everyone's still, you know, able to do their other business on the street.
Okay, good enough. Let's see if there are any questions or concerns regarding sidewalk space. Anyone want to touch on that? Sam?
Yeah, so I was wondering what specific changes are you planning to the clear path regulations that currently govern sidewalk cafes? Are there, you know, we see that, you know, I saw the chart before where you had the 8 feet, 12 feet, and then down at the bottom it said in some areas it could be cut to 6 feet.
Yeah.
So what are the decision rules about how those sidewalk spaces get defined?
Sure. So, you know, the first thing is the width of the sidewalk, and that really, you know, sets the clear path. If the restaurant doesn't meet this 8 or 12 clear path, and then they still, you know, want to apply for the program, they can apply for this waiver. And the waiver would be, you know, looked at by both DOT and the Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities. And that's really to make sure that looking at pedestrian flow and what other uses are happening on this specific sidewalk to make sure that ADA accessibility needs are still met, and the other balances of that sidewalk are still, you know, something that everyone is keeping in mind. And if DOT and MOPD feel that they are, then they would grant the waiver. And if they feel that they're not, and it's just not possible, they would deny that restaurant.
So you use the waiver word again, and I keep hearing that word and I cringe every time. Is there going to be transparency around these waivers? Is there going to be community input? I have a concern about that.
Yeah, sorry, Carolyn, if you're.
Well, just to note that again, right now, the process for sidewalk cafe applications involves the community board. That's not changing. So if a sidewalk cafe is in an 8-foot zone, it would apply for its cafe under the 8-foot rule, or it would be, if it's in a 12-foot zone, it would apply under the 12-foot rule. Or if as part of its application, it's trying to prove its case to go to 6 feet, then that would also be part of its application. So I think the point is the context is the community board will be involved in that sidewalk cafe review. Regardless, the waiver is an additional element requiring extra scrutiny as part of that overall application package.
And so, excuse me. And so when you do the ped counts, do you take into account the seasonality of the pedestrian traffic?
Yes.
It's like just say during the holidays, for example, the volume I assume would be greater, and the space would be tighter. How do you take that stuff into account?
That's definitely taken into account. We do counts, at all different times of the year, and then make sure that that's noted so that we're very consistent throughout when we do these counts, and know exactly when they're done, and can be consistent each year.
Will there be a way for us to request a ped count in an area that we're concerned about?
Jennifer, or I don't know how much.
Just step back out of that question. I think where it's going again is just to reiterate, I think what we were saying, which is that much of CB5, because it is an area that has high volumes in general, is where this new 12-foot zone is intended to go. That's going to be part of the DOT rules package. And to the extent that the community board has feedback on where 12-foot zones are or not appropriate, that's welcome, right? And to the extent, I think to that earlier point about revisiting that and how we might revisit that, I think that is something that we can all sort of discuss. It probably can't be an infinite, recursive revisiting of it, but I think the general idea here is that 12 feet are very appropriate in situations in Midtown. We want to make sure we've gotten that quite right. And so there'll be an opportunity to review that really block by block and also to revisit it over time.
Great. Sam, something else?
One other thing, what was your experience with snow removal and this roadbed restaurant program during the winter? And, are there contingency plans for high volumes of snow and the need to remove it?
Yeah, so the snow, over this past winter, sanitation was able to mostly remove snow, but of course, where the cafes were, obviously they were not. That is why we want this program to be seasonal in the roadway, so that during those winter months, sanitation would have a very easy chance, an easy time getting through with their first snow removal.
Okay, let's pick up the pace. Renee Cafaro.
Real quick, does the clear path requirements also take into account a minimum amount of feet that you should be for the roadway section to be away from the curb cut to allow for when there's a lot of people crossing the street or for snow removal and stuff like that? I've seen a lot of congestion around curb cuts with the roadway cafes abutting a little too close. Are you going to be providing sort of a minimum that it needs to be from other things and street furnitures and fire lanes, et cetera?
All of that would be included in the design guidelines.
Okay.
Great. Let's hear if there are any quality of life questions or concerns. Barbara.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't quite decide where my question fell into, but going back to the design guidelines that you just mentioned, and there's discussion about these being, talking about the roadway portion of the outdoor dining. Is there going to be any minimal structural criteria for this? I heard somebody mention that they didn't want an engineered drawing, but you know, you've got barriers that are adjacent to traffic, and you know, it just you certainly wouldn't want. You would want at least some sort of minimum impact
Good question.
criteria, I would think.
Yeah. Julie,
Go ahead, Karin.
oh, I was going to say I can take this. Yes, there will be. So our engineers, as Julie mentioned before, they're looking really closely at lessons learned through the emergency program, both in terms of the setting criteria and also the structures themselves. And they're really trying to weigh the need to have structures that can be removed with the safety issues that you brought up. And so we are looking very closely at that.
Great, thanks. Renee Kinsella. Unmute. All right, Renee, we'll come back to you. Mike Greeley.
Hello, thank you. I just wanted to know, will DOT shepherd the applicant, the restaurant, through the application process like DOT does with the inner city bus stops on the street, or is it going to be more like what DCA does with the newsstand applicants for newsstand on the sidewalk?
So, I mean, it's Colleen, if I could address that. We work very closely with the inner city applicants where we review the locations and their schedules as well to make sure there are no conflicts. That's a totally different process. I mean, we are going to be working, yes, with the restaurants to make sure that the guidelines that they follow, as well as they meet the criteria and are in compliance. But I just want you to know that keep in mind the whole intercity bus stop application is a totally different process from this as well.
Yes, I understand that. I'm just saying that we've seen other city agencies not help the applicants through the community board process, whereas I see DOT help the bus companies through the community board process.
I mean, we will help the restaurant owners through the process, yes. But it'll be different from the inner city, you know, applications or the applicants. I mean, we'll be there to answer to answer questions that they may have and address any concerns in terms of the citing and what criteria are involved.
I think that's good enough. Renee Kinsella?
Yes, thank you. You said that the rationale for this text amendment is a more robust dining experience. Given all the competing interests for the space on the street and on the sidewalk, are you working with the restaurant association or restaurants directly to really understand with data if in fact this program is expanding business or merely shifting the business from indoors to outdoors?
We can certainly say that we've been talking to both the restaurant association, bids, other neighborhood stakeholders. And I think there's very strong advocacy for this text amendment from that community because they believe that the outdoor space is necessary, valuable, and a positive attribute to the community. So I think the question about whether it's shifting outdoors, you know, that's certainly not something we've heard. I think what we've heard is that businesses are, you know, what was sort of a lifeline is now like seen as a possible way of doing business in the future, and that restaurants want that opportunity to do that, and that where zoning was standing in the way of that, you know, that's something that they're interested in, you know, in removing.
Got it. Layla, let's pick up the pace.
Thank you. Is EDC involved in this process in any way, shape, or form?
We've definitely had a number of meetings with them and collaborated with them and continue to keep them in our interagency coordination groups.
Thank you.
Great. Todd, quickly.
Okay, in reviewing the materials, did I see that the grant of the outdoor cafe license was 4 years with a review every year. Can you just explain exactly how that's going to work and why you came up with that number? In my experience,
let's not talk about your experience right now. I think it was a good question. Let them answer.
The idea is to have this process be a little bit more nimble and simple than the previous sidewalk cafe process has been. And so having this 4-year renewal process, the restaurant would only have to reapply every 4 years. That's the goal. If we see, but to have the annual review on the DOT side, just so that we can make sure that everyone is, keeping up with what they're supposed to be doing and make sure that everything is still in compliance and still staying within the guidelines.
And is that annual review intended to be, is the community board intended to be part of that process?
I think the annual review would just be on the DOT side. The renewal process would be with the community board.
Got it. Okay, July, quickly.
Thank you. In your presentation material, it's existing sidewalk cafes will be grandfathered in. So is this program creating more sidewalk cafes? And if so, do we need more? And then I have a second question relating to enforcement and quality of life. How many, what types of complaints from residents and how frequently will get a establishment to not renew their license? Thank you.
So I can take the first question just to clarify. The grandfathering was really in reference to the 100 existing enclosed cafes. Those are being allowed to continue even though that program won't exist under zoning any further. In terms of other grandfathering in, I think what we're really what we're talking about in the zoning text amendment is the 2,500 cafes that exist under the emergency program that would have no way to be authorized once the emergency ends because they're prohibited or limited under zoning. So it's not about grandfathering in the existing condition, it's about allowing those 2,500 citywide cafes some path to legalization post-emergency.
Is DOT considering approximately 2,500 in the program, or it's potentially going to be many more than that?
Well, it would be 2,500 that were grandfathered in, and then others can apply.
That would be allowed, would be potentially eligible post-emergency. So we, just to clarify, we don't know how many people will actually use the future program, right? We know there were 1,200 cafes in the city total before COVID, and we know there are 11,000 cafes in the city during the emergency. And the question is how many of those 11,000 will remain. What we're doing is making it possible for many of them to possibly remain, but they will still have to pay a fee. They will still have to go through the application process, and all of those steps. So it's not clear by any respects that 11,000 emergency cafes will continue, but what we're trying to do is remove the zoning barriers that allow them to apply.
One question I haven't heard yet is regarding hours of operation. So now these outdoor cafes are required to close at midnight. What's the intention going forward?
The intention is it would be the same as the current sidewalk cafe hours.
And for the edification of the committee, can you say what that is?
Yeah, sorry. It's till midnight, Sunday through Thursday, and 1 a.m. Friday and Saturday.
Okay. David Sigmund. Let's go quickly.
Just quickly, can the owner of a vacant space apply for this, or only a restaurant operator can apply for it?
This would just be eligible to restaurants. They have to have a certain license.
A DOHMH license, the letter grade that restaurants have.
Great. EJ?
What's the month-to-month seasonality intended to be? And the fee structure, is that an annual fee? Is it tied to square footage or anything along those lines?
Both are still up for discussion. The seasonality, we're looking to have this through the spring, summer, and fall months, still to be determined exactly what that would be, and similar with the fee structure. We do not know exactly what the fees will be yet.
And I would just note that you can certainly take a look at the pre-existing DCWP fee structure. Not that that's a perfect, comparator, because this is still very much up for grabs, but that was square footage based. And it was somewhat dynamic to different areas of the city.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. Okay, before we go to the public, are there any other questions, immediate questions from the committee? Any questions or comments from the committee before we go to the public? Okay, let's see. Any members of the public would like to comment, please raise your hand. I see a couple now. Let's start with Larry Aronson. Luke, you want it?
Yep, Larry, you should be able to unmute.
And camera.
I can promote him to panelist, but as an attendee, he is not able to.
Yeah, I'd like to see the speakers.
Okay, just a minute. Larry, you'll be joining as a panelist.
Okay.
All right. Larry.
There we go. I'm trying.
Great.
And you want me to keep my video off?
No, we'd like to see you while you speak.
Sure. Okay, how are we doing now?
Hi, Larry.
I have two quick questions. Can I take as much as 4 or 5 minutes, and can I share my screen?
Why don't I'd rather be more efficient than give any one speaker 45 minutes.
No, not 45.
4 or 5. So
4 or 5.
If you like, why don't I get to some of the other questions and comments, and then we can come back to you.
Very good. Thank you.
All right. Gail Klein, let's hear what you have to say.
Gail will be joining as a panelist. I'm waiting. I don't know if she has to accept the invitation.
Yeah, I don't want this to be too cumbersome. If it is, then we'll just do audio.
Okay.
Gail, can you hear us? You have to unmute.
I've requested Gail to unmute. Not seeing. If you're on a phone, Gail, *6.
So let's come back to Gail. Mario?
And Mario's coming in as a panelist. Mario.
Yeah, I'm unmuting. Thank you. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. First of all, I'd like to thank the people for the presentation. They have done a great job. Second of all, I'd like to thank the committee of CP5, the various committees, for the great questions that they've asked. I just want to make and underline some points that I believe that are very important. I believe that the initiative has been great, and it has been doing some good for the community as well as for the industry. We like to caution about some venues because I believe that they are abusing the space that they are using.
So, Mario, we probably shouldn't go venue by venue. No, I think in this forum, we should probably talk a little bit more generally about your concerns about the permanent project.
Right. Okay. The permanent project, I think that it doesn't have any problems unless it becomes too much of an obstacle course for the people. For example, I believe that they shouldn't have the pubs as well as the street extensions to use as a restaurant, but one or the other. And also, I believe that they should be extremely guided and governed so that there is some quality of life, noise control that right now at times is lacking. That's it.
Got it. Thank you, Mario. Gail, are you ready now?
I've asked her to unmute and promote. No response.
Okay, Jim Wright.
Promoted.
Should be joining as a panelist.
You done?
Yeah.
No, I didn't put it on yet.
You did, you had it on.
Jim Wright?
All right, Jim, you can unmute.
Jim, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Okay, I'm back. I was disconnected shortly. Apologize for that. A couple of comments on the quality of life questions. Obviously, this has been a boon to restaurants, and it's great. There has been some quality of life issues. The noise issue, I think in particular, has been an issue on our block. I'm a resident on 27th Street. And I just, there hasn't been adequate enforcement of noise regulations, and somehow that needs to be built into DOT's enforcement. The second question I have has to do with the clear walking space. There's a lot of obstructions that exist on sidewalks that a restaurant might not have control over. You know, post office boxes, Linksys signs, even pillars for sidewalk sheds, which inevitably, if there's a street enclosure, cuts down on the clear space. So
sure.
The question, I guess, for the city is how you're going to deal with those kind of very, very site-specific conditions.
So similar to what I had mentioned before about the design guidelines, there would be criteria, citing criteria from all obstructions on the sidewalk and street, giving restaurants exact details on how far they have to be from everything.
Thanks, Julie.
And the noise issue, DOT we'll have an enforcement team that will be.
So will you be allowing obstructions within that 8-foot zone, or is it totally a clear zone?
There.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. Leslie Hendricks.
All right, Leslie, you should be able to unmute.
Okay, am I good?
Yes, we can hear you.
One is I found with most sidewalk cafes that are there already is there tends to be creep. What started out as one single tables against the building then becomes double tables, and pretty soon there's no sidewalk and there's never any enforcement of that. And I don't know how, if this is going to work at all, there has to be really good enforcement. And then the second is because now that there are protected bike lanes, I've started commuting by scooter. And what I have found on Broadway and some of the other, some of the blocks in Soho is that there are 4 and 5 restaurants in a row, and the bike lane goes right through. It's scary as it is, but if more restaurants take advantage of this, probably from 30th Street all the way down past Union Square, you're going to have the protected bike lane going right through restaurant after restaurant after restaurant. And my question on this is, do those tables need to be handicapped accessible? Is there a ramp that needs to go in because there's a curb? And if so, how's that going to work on bike lanes?
That's a good question. We haven't heard that before.
All of the restaurants, any sort of outdoor seating will have to be ADA accessible. There will have to be a ramp, and I think that is a really good question and one that would be included in our design.
So there'll be no bike lane.
Well, the goal is the goal is to have the bike lane as well. So we would, it'd be one of the things that we'd have to take a look at, and making maybe that restaurant would not be able to set up if there was that issue.
Great. Okay, thank you. Jordana.
She's joining as a panelist.
Hello.
Hi.
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. I don't know if our question, my husband and I, has to do with length of bars, outdoor cafes. Even though we live on 36 and we have few of outdoor, and the noise is beyond. But our issue is noise beyond coming from a bar across our street. Is that something we can talk about?
Yeah, we've already talked about noise and enforcement as things that really need to be addressed. Do you have any other issues besides noise that you'd like to talk about?
Well, this particular location that we're concerned about is not the problem, is not the outdoor cafe, though they do have one. It's the huge lines, it's the noise, it's the pissing in the street, it's the
I hear you. I hear you. So
it's
right now we're
until
talking
4
about
in the morning.
I hear you. Right now we're talking about the zoning text amendment. Why
Right.
don't I suggest that you contact the board office about the other specific issues you
I have tried. I sent email, but nobody wrote back to us.
We'll have Luke contact you.
Oh, that'd be great, please.
All right.
Thank you.
Rachel, let's hear from Rachel. Rachel Cornefeld.
Right. She's joining as a panelist.
Rachel, we can hear you.
Great. Hi. Thanks so much for having me. I'm with Boqueria Restaurant. We have 4 locations in New York City, and we have greatly benefited from the open restaurants program at all of our restaurants. A lot of concerns tonight, and I wanted to come back and just talk a little bit about what this program has meant to restaurants. Can you still hear me?
Yes, real quick.
Okay, great. Thanks. So we were one of the 11,000 restaurants who were saved by this program. We rehire our staff, business or vendors, create a connection with our neighbors, still never even broke even. And so, I heard a comment earlier about restaurants double the seating. We're seating, let's call it 40 extra seats outside, and we're still only at about 75% of capacity of where we are. So this program was not only vital during the pandemic, but it's vital to us now. It's helping us dig our way out of the hole that we've dug ourselves in. And it's really important to us being able to pay our debts, pay our rent. A lot of restaurants are on percent of rent negotiation with their landlords now. So we can make more money through these open restaurants program. We can pay more rent. We can provide more jobs. I think the other thing for us is that, I'm a New Yorker. I actually live in the district, obviously. And I walk around, I see all these shuttered businesses, and I'm seeing increases in graffiti. But the open restaurants program is the thing that's making New York feel alive again. It's making people go, okay, the city is back. It's vibrant. It's energetic. We're so happy to be contributing to that as a restaurant. And I think it's really important that people see that sign of life so that businesses want to come back and residents want to come back. I'm happy to answer any other questions about what it's like to be a restaurant in this, if there are any.
Well, we'll send people to
Thank
Boqueria
you.
if they have any more questions. Gail
I will
Klein.
get ready to answer them. Thank you.
All right, Rachel. Gail Klein, are you ready?
All right. I've tried to promote her to that. Hey, there she goes. All right, Gail, you should be able to
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Gail.
Hi, thank you guys so much for sticking with me. I had some problems on my phone there.
Got it. Let's go quick now.
I'm calling from Stout Hospitality Group, and we have 11 restaurants in New York City. Specifically, I'm calling about our restaurants on 33rd Street, right in the heart of CB5. It has been a huge lifeline for us to have the outdoor cafe. It's really helped to rehire some employees, definitely not all. We had to lay off over 400 employees. So it's been great to get people back working. And one thing I also wanted to add, we're really hopeful that you keep this. We think it's just great for the city and great for business. But I'd also like to say, and in particular on 33rd Street, it's really helping the quality of life on this block. We have a lot of people that work in the area and are glad that we're here because we're adding safety. This neighborhood in particular has been really hit hard with empty storefronts and a lot of vagrants
Yeah, we get
in
it.
the area.
We get it. Anything
So we
else?
think it also adds safety, and open businesses, and we hope that it continues.
Thank you, Gail.
Thanks.
Anyone else before we go to Larry? All right, Larry, let's see if we can cut your presentation down from 45 minutes to 2.
Oh, thank you, Chairman. Fortunately, a lot of other people raised my basic concerns.
Excellent. That's why I did what I did.
Okay, I appreciate it. And my thanks to the Department of Transportation and the City Planning Commission. Excellent presentations, of which I'm wholeheartedly in favor of.
Let's get to your questions, Larry.
Okay. What I wanted to do was present a case study of what happens with the worst abusers of the program. And I can send a bunch of photographs later if you want to shorten the time. But
yeah,
there's
you can
two
send
problems.
them to the board office.
I have been sending some of mine. The two problems with the plans for the Department of Transportation is that it is generally infused with the assumption that everything has been perfectly fine and wonderful, and let's build on it. And even if you have 11,000 participating restaurants and say 98% of them are in fully compliance with all the original criteria that was set out in June of last year, 2% is 2,200 or 220 restaurants which are creating hazards, endangering public safety, increasing rats and all sorts of things, the problems all over the place. I'm not going to go into my specific case study, nor will I mention the restaurant. I think some of the people in here know who it is. I'm on 20th Street between 5th and 6th.
So Larry, I think everybody wants to hear your comments about the zoning text amendment.
The zoning text amendment is fine. I have no problem with that, except that it's going to take until the middle of 2013, and that's assuming that there's no litigations or lawsuits or injunctions against it. And right now, the situation on my block is intolerable. A restaurant has literally annexed with coverings and long, lengthy sidewalk semi-permanent structure, about 100 or so feet of restaurant with tables for a seating of 60. The sidewalk there is narrow, only 6 feet along the iron fence of the Limelight Church. And it should never have met, it never would have met the original criteria. It's been a source of problems. The wait staff trying to get into the street from the one gate in the courtyard literally pushed pedestrians aside.
Larry, you ask a good question, and maybe DOT and DCP can address that. So what happens where there are current operations that would be non-compliant?
Yes.
Will they be grandfathered? Is there going to be enforcement? Are they going to cease operations? Tell us how that's going to work.
Thank you.
Similar to what I had said before, we are really ramping up our enforcement efforts. We'll have a full team at DOT that's enforcing, and we will not stand for the compliance going forward. So the restaurant would not be grandfathered in if they are not in compliance with the new rules.
Okay, Larry, last point. What do you have?
Well, I would appreciate that they have, cease and desist your operations in the streets. If a restaurant was looking for a place to open up an annex, say with tables seating for 60s,
Larry, let me
imagine what a private landlord would ask in rent and a percentage of that, and the city's not really getting anything.
Larry, let me try to focus you a little bit.
Okay.
What's your next point?
No, I pretty much made my point, and I'll follow up and continue on these issues because, as I said, it's not tolerable on my block right now.
Got it. Thank you, Larry.
1 second.
Any other comments from the public? Anyone else? Okay, so let's put the committee into business session now, and during this period, we will take comments from the committee. At this point, no further input from the public or the DCP or DOT is appropriate unless requested by the chair. Who would like to start? Sarah?
Yes, I'll start. My impression is this is a wonderful plan to continue open restaurants, but as we recover from COVID, we really need to take into account the costs of all the extra work that has to take place, the garbage removal, the narrow sidewalks, the bicycle lanes, and the dangers from them.
Yeah,
So
good point.
let's do it, but really take a look at what's going to happen after 2022.
Thank you, Sarah. David Achilles.
Yes, it seems there's a lot going on with this approach. And with all due respect to my friends at the Department of Transportation, who did a great presentation and who I know personally, a couple of them, the last people I want doing enforcement are the Department of Transportation. Why are they getting into the restaurant business now? They have totally left us down with the bike situation, which we've talked about many, many times before. If they want to start doing this enforcement, let's start now. Let's start cleaning up the place before we have to rush and vote on a resolution. Let's see them start doing some enforcement, see if they can handle it. For them to handle the restaurant business, it just seems inappropriate. I think we need a special task force to take this on. That's not the Department of Transportation, that should be taking care of other situations. And I think we know what we're talking about in that situation. And I hate this arbitrary deadline if we have to rush through this. We need to talk this out. We need to really figure out what we're doing before we make these quick decisions on this. I'm all for the restaurants, saving the restaurants, but there's so many in violation already. Let's see if the Department of Transportation can actually do enforcement right now, starting next week. Thank you.
Good point. EJ.
Building off that, I think we can find a little bit of a middle ground with the type of thing that David was just talking about. On the T&E committee, we talk pretty frequently about wishing that we could empower DOT to do more enforcement of other things like bike lanes themselves, instead of relying on NYPD, who generally seem spread very thin. So I'm frankly encouraged by a lot of what we heard about DOT considerably beefing up its enforcement capabilities. What we seem to hear tonight is that there's a specific zoning resolution text amendment in front of us, and then plans to come that I'm sure DOT will come back to us with when they have a more specific plan. So I think what we have before us tonight is weighing in on a specific text amendment and potentially stapling onto that recommendations for the plan that DOT is generating for the two other programs, but which don't exist yet. We can't weigh in on programs that don't exist yet. So I think, what we could potentially do tonight, based on, the comments and opinions of the rest of the committee, are weigh in on these specific zoning amendments, and then make recommendations for the plans that are to come. For example, if I'm understanding this correctly, and other folks can correct me, but certain things that were written into zoning, like no cafes in Times Square, the theater district and the garment district, are now being shifted to what will be the citing criteria in the plan. So I think we need to be careful when we weigh in on these zoning amendments, what criteria we're going to expect to see in the guidelines and the plans that are yet to come, because they're being removed from the zoning. So I think that is potentially a framework for, and as David said, I think one thing that we can request quite clearly is that this ramped up enforcement should start this summer instead of waiting for 2022 and when the permanent program goes into effect. That would be a sign of good, considerable goodwill as well.
I'd actually like to hear from DOT about that.
So we are doing enforcement. I think, you're right that there are a number of bad actors that we've seen, and a lot of lessons that we've learned and challenges that we've learned throughout the emergency program. We have just started to really take a look at and enforce in a way that we haven't done before, where we're starting to now remove restaurants that are not in full compliance, ones that are really in bad safety locations, in bus lanes, as you mentioned before, some that are in front of hydrants. and take some real action there is just removing their restaurants after giving them very, very clear warnings. So we are starting to do that enhancement of enforcement.
Do you intend to hit the number of enforcement folks that you intend to beef that office up to? Is that going to happen like beginning of this summer, end of this summer, beginning of next summer? When do you hit that?
I don't have the exact timing of that, as it depends on when we're able to hire, but I don't have the exact timing on when that will happen.
Okay. Layla?
Yeah, thank you. Just to build on what EJ just said, I think that we basically have, two separate presentations that were made to us tonight. One has really to do with, the technical aspect of the land use proposal, which is a, citywide zoning tax amendment. And basically, it just means that there will no longer be any zoning and Department of City Planning rules and regulations as it pertains to sidewalk cafes. This is very technical. This is very narrow. This is something that we need to weigh in on, and I think that we can do that tonight. For the broader transportation issue and quality of life issue, it looks, if I understand correctly, that we may have more time and more opportunities to comment and weigh in. And if indeed this is the case, I would suggest that we explore that so that we don't have to rush into making comments on design guidelines that don't even exist, and maybe we can be proactive and actually make some recommendations as DOT is working on these design guidelines to actually inform them of what the community's wishes are as it pertains to these new structures, especially for the roadway restaurants. So I'll make a comment strictly on the land use application that is in front of us. Overall, we don't have any residential neighborhoods in CD5, so the residential restriction does not apply to us, and I think we need to be careful not to comment on that, because residential neighborhoods should be doing their own commenting on that. On the areas where sidewalk cafes were not permitted because our district is congested, I think that I don't see any objection to actually remove these zoning provisions, provided that then it is kicked into DOT, and that the citing decision is a mindful one. But shifting the authority from the Department of City Planning to DOT, seems reasonable. And I personally, as the chair of the Land Use Committee, I don't have any objections.
Great. So I think we should follow that lead, that it's appropriate and timely for us to comment on the zoning aspects, but that we should wait for the rest of the plan to take more shape before we finalize our comments. So in that vein, unless somebody disagrees, why don't we hear some of the concerns or comments that we would want to see in a resolution regarding the zoning component?
Very quickly, Nick, if we can ask the applicant to actually put the last slide so that we understand the timeline, I think that would be helpful. If they're still able to, oops.
Yeah, it looks like they're still on.
I'm sorry. Yeah, if you can bring the last slide with the timeline, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Is this the one you're looking for?
Yes.
Did you have any particular comments about that, or?
No, I think if you can just leave it on so that we know what we're talking about, and we can make our comments with that timeline in mind. Thank you. If you can just keep this slide on. Thanks.
Does anyone want to start with any specific concerns or comments we want to include in a resolution regarding the zoning aspects? Layla, do you want to guide us about that?
Sure. Basically it's zoning text amendment, which means that some provisions of the zoning resolution would be amended. In essence, what we learned today is that the entire chapter that pertains to siting of sidewalk cafes would be removed. What that means is that the areas where sidewalk cafes are restricted in our district would now become permitted, and the siting would then become the jurisdiction of the Department of Transportation. So, as I said, I personally don't have an objection to that. I think that, it makes sense to actually, consolidate the jurisdiction of these matters under one city agency. And, provided that the design guidelines and the siting rules of the DOT are mindful of our needs, I don't see any objection to actually removing this authority from the Department of City Planning and bringing it to the DOT.
Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to get at. So we're okay with the zoning text amendment, if I understand what you're saying, provided that we have comment on the design guidelines during that process and the citing requirements, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah.
Okay, Mike Greeley, you have your hand up.
So if we're going to vote tonight on just the zoning text amendment, I'm supportive of it. If we're going to have another meeting later on about the design guidelines, I just would like something to be included about how the restaurants apply for it and about the enforcement and the community board's role in all of it.
Absolutely. EJ?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I would mention that they should come back to us about the design guidelines, that the citing criteria must protect things that are being removed from the zoning, like protecting high traffic areas, theater district and garment district, that we, will recommend a strong fee structure commensurate with the public use area that's being taken. I mean, these are things they can incorporate into the guidelines, but we still want to have a voice in the guidelines when they come back to us. And finally, I would say, like Mike just said, a strong endorsement of DOT driven an enforcement team, empowered to write up all violations of all manner, busway obstruction, sidewalk obstruction, building over streetscape elements, etc.
Got it. Joel Maxman.
Right. So I'm not sure this goes into the zoning text amendment, but stop me if it's not. So I'm concerned about the traffic issues and all the pedestrian issues and bike issues that we talked about earlier, but particularly traffic issues caused by, or that might be caused by in the street restaurants, cafes. And I think it's too early, because COVID isn't over, to know, when traffic comes back full force and when people are back full force and pedestrians are back full force and biking is only growing, what the impact is of the loss of all this blacktop to restaurants on traffic and biking and pedestrians. And I'm concerned that it's too early to say. And
I think that's exactly what we're saying then. That's exactly what we're saying. I think if I understand the comments so far, we're okay with the text amendment, which essentially changes the responsibility from DCP to DOT, but that we will be weighing in on how DOT operates and all of those concerns that you mentioned.
So no, what I understood is that we're also saying the text amendment would do away with the prohibitions on this use of the street, and say this is okay, that all these in the street cafes are okay, and may be subject to some design guidelines or something like that. But once we approve it, we can't go back. I mean, it's very difficult to go back. And I'm saying, before we take an emergency program and make it permanent, I think we need more data, in real life data, not COVID data.
Okay.
So just to comment on that, basically what Joel's saying is that and this is something that indeed we could do. We could basically say, we're fine with a zoning text amendment that basically does away with the fact that city planning has jurisdiction, but nonetheless, the rules have to stay. And then once, if that were to happen, then we would have, an additional layer, an opportunity to comment and to basically say, okay, yes, the rules can be amended, and sidewalk cafes and roadbed restaurants are okay. Or we could say, actually, no, let's keep it exactly as the status quo. Or we could say, maybe in Times Square it's not a good idea, but on 57th, yeah, maybe it's okay. And I'm just mentioning these examples as like I'm not putting any value into them. So this is something that we need to give some consideration. And so the extent of my comment is to say, on a zoning standpoint, it is fine to actually kick this to DOT. Now, the effect that it would have on the rules themselves, Joel is raising an important point.
Essentially, we reserve the right to reject the program rules if they don't replicate all necessary traffic and lane zonings that we deem required for the proper flow of traffic, because it's being transferred to that later program that we have not yet weighed in on yet.
So if we're reserving that, then I'm okay. If we're reserving those protections and can comment on it later before it becomes effective, I'm good with that. Okay.
Great. Todd, what do you have to say?
I'm just picking up on the questions I asked earlier. My major concern, I'm okay with shifting it out of the zoning sphere into this new sphere, as long as we have the ability to actually see the new rules and the new regulations that are proposed. But again, to me, the most important thing, and I got to just talk about it very quickly, is that when we're reviewing these applications, I hope that our period of review, if they're giving out a 4-year license, to me, that's very long. I hope that the reality of it is, if they review it every year, that the community board have the ability to comment on it every year. And that, ultimately, as we know from our experience, it's our ability to comment and take the temperature of the neighborhood that is going to be a deterrent to the bad actors and allow the community to have some input. Because, it's going to be on the community boards more than ever to identify those areas where these sidewalk cafes and these things in the street are going to be placed and allowed to operate for, extended periods of time.
Yeah, and I think that concern will properly be raised when we review the DOT procedures. Maki.
Thank you, Nick. In addition to the recommendations on the pedestrians, I'd like to suggest that we specifically address ADA concerns and requirements, both for restaurant patronage as well as throughway and transportation needs, and also identifying the enforcement as well as tracking of noise concerns specifically to open restaurants, which sound like it's been consistently identified by residents in the mixed-use areas. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, we'll have to address that with DOT. Any other conditions to our approval? And I say that intentionally. It sounds to me like we're approving this with certain conditions. Any other conditions that anyone would like to raise? Okay, so Leila, if you would be so kind as to frame the motion.
You're muted, Leila.
Sorry, guys. I make a motion to approve the citywide zoning text amendment with the condition that the existing rules would be kept intact but fall under the jurisdiction of the Department of Transportation, and that we urge the DOT to engage with the community board on the design guidelines, both prior to the spelling out of these design guidelines and once they're formulated through a hearing, giving us an opportunity to actually formally comment, incorporating language in the effect that Maki suggested on ADA compliance and noise. I hope I'm not missing anything. But basically, the conditions that we have expressed during this meeting would be incorporated in our recommendation.
Is there a second?
I second.
Okay, let's take this to a vote. Craig, just so that the committee knows, we're now a committee of the whole. All of this 4 separate committees are now one committee of the whole, and we will vote in that manner. New members, people who just joined the board will not have the opportunity to vote during this cycle. But as you saw, their participation was welcome. Let's take this to a vote.
Thanks, Nick. Kalis.
Yes.
Athanael.
Yes.
Behar.
Yes.
Eichmann, sorry, why is this here? Berman.
Yes.
Cafaro.
Yes.
Chu.
Yes.
Clark.
Yes.
Dosen.
Yes.
Brewer.
Yes.
Goldman is not here. Gasha.
Yes.
Greeley.
Yes.
Haas.
Yes.
Hykalis. George on? He's on. I'll come back to him.
Are you saying Harris?
George, yes. George.
Oh, George.
Okay, I'll come back.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Harris.
Yes.
Higher.
Yes.
Isaacs.
Yes.
Johnson.
Yes.
Kabak.
Yes.
Kaliforski.
Yes.
Kinsella.
Yes.
Logisico.
Yes.
Levy.
Yes.
Lusick.
Yes.
Mafia.
Yes.
Maxman.
Yes.
McCall. She's off. Okay. Pawson. She's off. Okay. Shapiro. Todd.
Yes.
Slutskin, yes. Spandorf.
Yes.
Sung.
Yes.
Jinko.
Yes.
Webb.
Yes.
Weintraub.
Yes.
Whalen.
Yes.
Yang.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, thank you, everyone. That concludes the first item. Parks and Public Spaces, Transportation Environment. Thank you for your participation tonight. You're relieved at this point, but you can certainly stay on if you'd like to observe the second matter on the agenda, which will be a joint meeting of the PSQL and Land Use Committees regarding the Health and Fitness Zoning Text Amendment. We'll take a quick check of attendance right now to make sure that there's a quorum of both of those committees, and then we will begin.
There is, Nick.
Okay.
Yeah, there is.
All right. So this is Manhattan Community Board 5, a joint meeting of the Committee Public Safety, Quality of Life, Land Use, Housing and Zoning. We will now hear a presentation by DCP regarding the Health and Fitness Zoning Text Amendment.
All right. Thank you and good evening. I'm Dylan Sandler. I'm a senior planner at the Department of City Planning. I realize it's a long meeting, and so I'll be fairly brief in my presentation, and then I'm happy to take any questions or go into more detail that's helpful for the board. So this is a proposal for a citywide text amendment to cut red tape for health-related businesses, so gyms, spas, and licensed massage therapy, with the intention of making it easier for these businesses to open in the city and providing more health-related amenities in communities. The kinds of businesses that are impacted by this include the larger chain gyms like Blink and Planet Fitness, and also smaller independent gyms and fitness studios that exist around the city. So things like martial arts studios and Pilates, yoga, cycling, and many others. And it also includes therapeutic and wellness activities like spas and massage therapy. Currently, there is a special permit, a Board of Standards and Appeals special permit that is required to open these businesses almost anywhere in New York City. And this was a special permit that was created in the 1970s with the explicit purpose of trying to address concerns about commercial sex that was occurring in businesses using the term massage or health clubs. And so this was a particular concern in Manhattan and especially in and around Times Square. But things have really changed quite a lot since the 1970s. For one, there's just been a huge growth in the fitness and health industry and growth in many very legitimate businesses that are amenities and that are really desired by communities. So at the time that this was created, there really wasn't an anticipation that every martial arts studio and Pilates studio would have to go through this review from the Board of Standards and Appeals and go through community boards. And there have also been changes in the regulation of massage therapy. Massage is now licensed by the New York State Education Department, and there's a public registry of all licensed massage therapists that exists online. But these businesses continue to face significant barriers from this special permit. The process typically takes about 6 or 7 months to be approved. And it costs businesses in a range of $30,000 to $50,000 in fees to architects and land use attorneys to go through the process. It also is limited in the geography, or it limits the geography where gyms and spas are allowed. So most C1 districts, local commercial streets, do not allow gyms and spas, even if they were to go through the special permit process. So places that allow restaurants and laundromats and drugstores and all sorts of other commercial and retail uses don't allow gyms. And finally, at a time when there are concerns about retail vacancy, we want to make sure that our zoning rules are sufficiently flexible and that we allow businesses and growing sectors to occupy this space. So getting into the details of the proposal, there's a lot on the slide, but at its core, we are proposing to remove the BSA special permit entirely. And in its place, we would allow gyms and spas as commercial uses, as of right commercial uses. There would be a distinction in the zoning between small gyms and spas and larger gyms. So those that are under 10,000 square feet in floor area would be use group 6 and would be allowed in all commercial and manufacturing districts. And then larger gyms greater than 10,000 square feet would be use group 9 and slightly more limited in geography. So these would be allowed in higher density C1 districts and then the other C2 districts and up and manufacturing districts. For the purposes of CB5, this distinction doesn't matter. There are no lower density C1 districts. So gyms would be allowed in all of the commercial and manufacturing districts in CB5 at any size. And then for massage therapy, when we remove the BSA special permit, we would be treating massage as the same way that we treat other ambulatory healthcare uses. So this would be because they're a licensed medical profession, these would fit under use group 4A as a community facility, or they could be under use group 6B, a healthcare office. And this would allow massage therapy in all commercial and manufacturing districts, and also in most residential districts other than R1 and R2 districts in our lowest density areas. And just to note here that Unlicensed massage is illegal in New York State, and it is also explicitly not permitted in zoning. So we've maintained a prohibition on practicing massage without a license. So this only pertains to licensed massage therapy. And then finally, when gyms go to the Board of Standards and Appeals today for a special permit, there are sometimes conditions that are imposed related to noise and vibration to address concerns from communities. And so to try to maintain this protection, we are including performance standards in the zoning so that a subset of gyms will need to have an acoustical engineer present documentation showing that the spaces are designed to meet national standards related to impulsive noise and vibration. So this would apply to higher intensity gyms, so things that have weights or exercise equipment that have a higher likelihood of creating noise. It would not apply to lower intensity things like yoga or youth martial arts or spas. And these standards would apply in all mixed use buildings, in all commercial districts and mixed districts. And then just finally on the timeline, this was referred out by the City Planning Commission on May 19th. And so it's in front of all the community boards across the city and all of the borough presidents. And the review period ends July 27th. And then this will go back to the City Planning Commission for a public hearing and vote, and then on to the City Council. So I realized that was a lot of information in just a few minutes, but I wanted to pause and just am happy to take any questions from the board.
Thank you, Dylan. So let's open up the floor to committee members with questions or comments, starting with Layla.
I didn't hear clearly what you said. Use group 9 for gyms, and then use group A4 for massage therapists, but then you said it could also fall under another use group.
Yeah, so the way ambulatory healthcare works today, so for things like a psychiatry office or a dentist office or doctor's office, they are use group 4A, which is an ambulatory healthcare facility. And that is allowed in residential districts and commercial districts and M1 districts, the light manufacturing districts. And then they can also be allowed under use group 6B as a healthcare office, which also allows those kinds of uses in M2 and M3 districts, in heavy manufacturing districts. Okay. So this would be consistent with the way that other ambulatory healthcare uses are allowed.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Renee Cufaro.
So you said that the original reasoning behind the zoning restrictions was to sort of discourage commercial sex in these massage parlors and things of that nature on Times Square, but that's no longer an issue. I mean, we haven't seen it in a while to our committee, but you know, I know that there are still issues regarding you know, unsavory activity is happening in some massage parlors within the city, and nationally it's still an issue for human trafficking. Have you talked to Vice? Have you talked to the Human Trafficking Task Force to actually get the statistics that back up your statement that it's changed?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So you're right. We are not saying that commercial sex is not occurring under the name of massage, or that commercial sex is not still occurring in New York City. I think we're more saying that the special permit is not really needed anymore as a tool to address this. So yes, we've worked incredibly closely with the Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement and the Mayor's Office to End Gender-Based Violence in developing this proposal, and they are all very supportive of this. I sit on a human trafficking task force that includes the DA offices and sex crime units in the DA offices and NYPD civil enforcement units. And so they're all aware of this proposal. Just to talk about some of the details of that very briefly. So today, if there is a business that is saying they're offering massage and there is an expectation that there is commercial sex occurring or a complaint from community boards, the Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement can do an inspection and basically see that if somebody is practicing massage without a license or body rub or any other term, that kind of relates to that. They can issue a zoning violation and shut the business down for being in zoning what's called an adult physical culture establishment, which is an unpermitted use. We have created language in the zoning that basically replaces that definition with a new one for unlicensed physical treatment facilities, where we basically maintain the same prohibition, where we say that unlicensed massage is not a permitted use, whether that's a primary or an accessory use. And so if a business is offering that kind of service, that would be enforceable through zoning. And that is for you brought up human trafficking, and that is actually a valuable tool because the city wants to move away from basically having NYPD necessarily going in and arresting people and prosecuting people on charges of prostitution. And so this maintains a tool to basically shut down businesses that are engaging in that kind of activity. So we see this as basically maintaining the existing tools and not forcing the city into having to criminalize people who are engaging in commercial sex.
Thanks, Dylan. Joseph and Tristan did some due diligence on this subject. Do either of you want to address any of the research that you've done?
Sure, thanks, Nick. No, I mean, I think the presentation was really comprehensive and helpful. I mean, added some detail about the use group definitions that would apply to some of these. There's a lot of, in the information that we saw, there's a lot of benefits discussed that would be caused by this change, especially just allowing the fitness industry to be treated the same way as a lot of other commercial establishments, which would help them, especially post-COVID. And we were kind of struggling to think of, what concerns might community members have? What concerns do we have? I mean, one clear potential concern that we saw was that, the existing zoning requires that any, I think, owners, operators, or principals of businesses that fall under this physical culture classification, they have to have a background check done by the Department of Investigation before being allowed to open the business. I'm assuming that was helpful in trying to, stop known, criminal enterprises from opening businesses as fronts. So you might have touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could speak toward the loss of that as a tool to prevent, human trafficking or commercial sex. Is that something that NYPD has expressed concerns about, or any other city official?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up. They have not expressed concerns about that, and mainly because the way it actually plays out today is that only legitimate businesses are applying for the special permit. So your martial arts studio and your Pilates studio and your rock climbing gym, may be going through this process. But a business that's offering massage and it has sex work occurring they're not seeking a special permit in the first place. They're just renting a storefront and opening up. So even though there is a finding in the special permit that requires a criminal background check from the Department of Investigation, that is not seen as a useful tool in preventing these kinds of activities. And then I think more than that, we see it as a somewhat inappropriate use of an outdated use of zoning to basically, have this one industry, have to go through a criminal background check. We see this as something that doesn't really belong in zoning and isn't really serving its original purpose. So we feel pretty good about removing that.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks. That's helpful. And Nick, the only other point I would add is that, we were looking for statements of support or opposition to this from any, relevant parties, businesses. The Global Health and Fitness Organization, who represents gym and fitness owners, they're very supportive of this, as is the State Society for Massage Therapists. So obviously people in that industry are very supportive. We reached out to, and Luke helped us reach out to, various block associations. I don't think we've heard back yet, any community members, specifically opposed to this, but if something has come in since we last talked, would be happy to hear that. But there seems to be a lot of support, in general.
All right, and we'll certainly give the public the opportunity to speak on this subject as well. Layla?
So if you will allow it, Nick, I would like to share a bit of information with the rest of the committees and do a quick comment. In September 2010, the Consent and Variance Committee of Committee Board 5, which is a committee that no longer exists, but was tasked at the time to deal with these BSA applications, through their due diligence, visited a massage parlor. The name of the place was Bamboo Garden Spa, and basically observed that the ladies who worked at this establishment were not licensed at the time. The license already existed, and they were heavily made up, and it sounded rather suspicious. So we passed a resolution at the time to deny the application, and we went to testify the BSA. And subsequently, in 2018, actually the operation was closed down by the police, and the operator was actually arrested. So the notion that these establishments don't apply for a BSA special permit is not entirely true. We actually had another instance. It was actually the same operator, but a different venue, who also had applied for a BSA special permit. That being said, this is a very blunt tool when 99.9% of the applicants are actually very legitimate. So, this is something that we have to keep in mind. I want to get comfort in the fact that we're not going to miss out on the opportunity to actually witness some conditions that we would no longer witness because this process is eliminated, because, human trafficking is a tragedy. On the other hand, we have to balance it against the legitimate needs of legitimate operators of these establishments.
Thank you, Layla. Todd?
I just want to give my support to this proposal because I draw, having done a few of these types of establishments due diligence. I hear what Layla is saying, and certainly we have to be on the alert. But the reality is, there's no reason why gyms and dojos and some of these places should have to jump through hoops to open their businesses any more than restaurants or anybody else. I mean, I run a conference center myself. New York City is legendary for the bureaucracy and all of the regulation that businesses have to go through. Sometimes it's warranted, but in the current situation where we have all these empty storefronts and people need to exercise, I think this is to be supported.
Great, thank you. Anyone else from the committee want to speak before I go to the public? Okay. Oh, was that Tristan?
Hi, thanks, Nick. Sorry, I had to step away for a moment, but I worked with Joseph on this and we did the due diligence. And I just want to say I'm super in support of this. I think it's exactly what's needed. It's an example of bureaucracy being cut that's really going to, promote entrepreneurship, help the rebound, promote the proliferation of good, positive health centers, and help us combat, the obesity epidemic. And I think it's really going to contribute to helping New York City be a better, busier, healthier place.
Thank you. Okay. Would any members of the public like to comment on this issue? Click the raise hand button if you'd like to speak. Anyone? Okay, let's go into business session. Oh, wait.
Actually, Nick, I do see
I see somebody now too. Barrett, you're allowed to speak.
Hi, can you hear
What is
me?
your comment? Yes.
Hi, my name is Barrett Longcar. I'm a massage therapist. And I just wanted to say, I'm really in support of this. We came up against this permit the first time in 2011, and I met with the permit office, and to open a very small establishment with 2 rooms. It was going to cost me an extra $50,000 on top of the already 50 it was going to cost me to open the place. And the average massage therapist in New York makes about $50,000 a year. So that was a huge issue. And for us, what it's done is it's ensured that the jobs that we have are always with a corporate company, and it's taken it out of the hands of the actual massage therapist, which is not an ideal position for us to be in.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
I don't see anyone else. All right, let's go into business session now. And is there anyone else that anyone would like to start? If not, Leila.
Yeah, I think that, overall, this regulation is totally antiquated. It is punishing for actually the small business operators, for whom the cost of this application is really very hefty. I would just say that, if we can add some language to the purpose and the intent of the zoning text originally, and make sure that, all the provisions are taken so that, we're not removing any tool from the enforcement and prosecution toolbox. I think that, it's one of those no-brainer types of land use applications.
So if I understand your condition, it would be that any enforcement and prosecution tools that were in the zoning would now be assumed other ways.
Correct. I don't even know that it would be conditions. We just want to make sure that, saying something along the lines of, DCP has reached out to enforcement and DA and, prosecutorial instances of the city and the state, and that they have raised no objection to this zoning text amendment.
Okay. Does everyone share that feeling that enforcement and prosecution will be satisfactory? Or should we ask Dylan to address that again? Any questions about that? You can just speak if you have a comment about that point.
Yeah, I would just say that, just with this change, there is going to be one tool that's gone, which is like the background check for potential applicants, which is not going to be replaced and would not be continued at all. And then in general, the DA isn't even prosecuting prostitution or any of these crimes. So, I'm not really sure that we'll be able to ask them to start doing so again related to this application. But that might be a little bit off the subject matter.
So I think that the issue that I'll speak for myself, the issue that I have is not about prostitution. The issue that I have is about human trafficking.
Gotcha. Yeah. I think that still remains illegal. And I know ICE, for example, when I was doing the due diligence and research, they were, conducting raids of certain massage therapists that were a front for prostitution and human trafficking. And so I don't think this would impact, but that makes sense.
Dylan, okay, I'll give you just a moment to address that, because I think this is one of the few concerns that the committee has.
Certainly. Thank you. So I just want to emphasize again that we have coordinated very closely with the mayor's office to end gender-based violence on this. And they are the coordinating body in the city that is addressing issues around human trafficking, sex trafficking, and labor trafficking. And they are very supportive of this and don't see this as a proposal that removes existing tools. And in particular, it maintains the ability to investigate and shut down businesses that are believed to be engaging in human trafficking, and do it through a civil enforcement mechanism that makes it harder to operate those kinds of businesses, even if they are not prosecuting people engaged in commercial sex. So great. But thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Dylan. Rachel?
I just wanted to second what I think Todd and Tristan said and voice my support. I won't be repetitive though.
Great. If there isn't anything else, I think we can have a motion. Joseph, why don't you make the motion here?
All right, I motion for the committee to support this amendment. Of course, we'll go into the background. We'll talk about the due diligence that it sounds like DCP has done, especially in collaboration with the DA offices, the Office of Gender-Based Violence, and NYPD. But overall, I think the committee's been clear about the reasons that we support this.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, let's take it to a vote. Again, new members of the board won't have the opportunity to vote tonight.
Kalis,
Yes.
Athanail,
Yes.
Cafaro,
Yes.
Chu,
Yes.
Dosen,
Yes.
Frewer,
Yes.
Gashow,
Yes.
Greeley,
Yes.
Haas. Tristan,
Yes.
Higher,
Yes.
Isaacs,
Yes.
Kalafarsky,
Yes.
Kinsella,
Yes.
Logasico,
Yes.
Lusick,
Yes.
Mafia,
Yes.
Shapiro,
Yes.
Slutskin, yes. Sung,
Yes.
Schinkel,
Yes.
Weintraub,
Yes.
Yang.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Before we break, is there any new business? Does anyone have any new business? Members of the public, any new business? If so, raise your hand now. Okay, everyone, we're adjourned before 9 p.m. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks.
Good
Bye.
night.
Thank you.